The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a vast and powerful state in the heart of Central Europe. It existed from 1867 to 1918, but its story began much earlier. For centuries, the Habsburg dynasty ruled over a collection of different lands and peoples from their capital in Vienna. This powerful family controlled the Austrian Empire. One of the most significant parts of this empire was the Kingdom of Hungary. The Austrians and Hungarians had a long and often difficult history together. They were two distinct nations, with different languages, cultures and traditions, bound together under a single monarch. This arrangement was often a source of tension and required careful political balancing. The path to creating the Austro-Hungarian Empire was paved with conflict and compromise. In 1848, a wave of revolutions swept across Europe. The Hungarians, led by figures like Lajos Kossuth, demanded greater freedom and independence from Austrian rule. The revolution was eventually crushed, but the desire for self-governance in Hungary did not disappear. Austria, weakened by a major defeat against Prussia in 1866, realized it could no longer ignore the Hungarians. The Austrian Emperor, Franz Joseph I, needed to find a new way to hold his diverse empire together. He knew that a strong and stable realm required a happy Hungary. This led to a historic agreement in 1867, known as the Austro-Hungarian Compromise, or the Ausgleich. This compromise transformed the Austrian Empire into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, also known as the dual monarchy. Under this new system, Austria and Hungary became two separate, equal states. They had their own parliaments and their own governments to manage their internal affairs. However, they were united by having the same monarch, Franz Joseph I, who was Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. This unique political structure was an attempt to satisfy Hungarian demands, while keeping the vast territories under a single central ruler. The two halves of the empire also shared a few key ministries. They had a joint ministry for foreign policy, meaning they acted as one country on the world stage. They also had a common army and a shared finance ministry to pay for these joint responsibilities. It was a complex and often clumsy system. For the Austrians, it was a practical solution to prevent the empire from breaking apart. For the Hungarians, it was a major victory that restored much of their historic sovereignty. This dual monarchy would define the political landscape of Central Europe for the next 50 years. A sprawling empire united by a single crown. Life within the Austro-Hungarian Empire was incredibly diverse. It was less a single nation and more a mosaic of many different nationalities living side by side. The two dominant groups were the German-speaking Austrians and the Magyar-speaking Hungarians. These two groups held most of the political power. However, they were actually a minority in the empire as a whole. The majority of the population was made up of many other ethnic groups. This included Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Ukrainians, Romanians, Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Each of these groups had its own distinct language, its own unique culture, and its own rich history. This cultural mix made the empire a vibrant and dynamic place. Cities like Vienna, Budapest, and Prague were bustling centers of art, music, and intellectual thought. This was the era of composers like Gustav Mahler, artists like Gustav Klimt, and thinkers like Sigmund Freud. Cafes were filled with people from different backgrounds, debating politics and philosophy in various languages. In the countryside, life followed more traditional rhythms. Farming communities of Poles, Ukrainians, and Romanians worked the land, each preserving their local customs, folk music, and festivals. This incredible diversity was one of the empire's defining features. However, this tapestry of peoples was also a source of constant tension. While the German, Austrians, and Hungarians enjoyed a privileged position, the other groups, particularly the Slavs, often felt like second-class citizens. They wanted more rights and greater recognition for their own languages and cultures. For example, in the Austrian half of the empire, schools might be forced to teach in German, even in areas where most people spoke Czech or Polish. In the Hungarian half, the government actively pushed a policy of Magyarization, trying to force minorities to adopt the Hungarian language and culture. Daily life varied greatly depending on who you were and where you lived. An Austrian government official in Vienna had a very different experience from a Croatian farmer or a Polish factory worker in Galicia. Despite the political divisions, people from different groups often lived together in the same towns and villages. They traded with each other, worked together, and sometimes intermarried. Yet, the feeling of belonging to a specific national group grew stronger throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This rising tide of nationalism would ultimately prove to be one of the greatest challenges to the empire's survival. While the Austro-Hungarian Empire appeared powerful on the outside, it was plagued by internal problems. The biggest issue was nationalism. The Compromise of 1867 had only satisfied the Hungarians. It left the empire's large Slavic populations feeling ignored and resentful. Groups like the Czechs in Bohemia, the Poles in Galicia, and the South Slavs, Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes in the Balkans started to demand the same kind of rights and autonomy that the Hungarians had won. They wanted their own schools, their own local governments, and for their languages to be used in official business. These demands were a direct threat to the power of both Vienna and Budapest. The political structure of the dual monarchy made these problems worse. The Austrian and Hungarian governments often disagreed on how to handle the demands of the other nationalities. The Austrians were sometimes more willing to make small concessions to groups like the Czechs. However, the Hungarian leadership was very resistant to giving any power to the minorities within their kingdom, fearing it would weaken their own control. This constant political gridlock made it nearly impossible to find a lasting solution. The government was often paralyzed, unable to pass reforms that might have eased the growing ethnic tensions and saved the empire from its slow decay. Economic disparities also fueled the discontent. Some regions of the empire, like Austria and Bohemia, were heavily industrialized and prosperous. They had factories, railways, and modern cities. Other areas, particularly in the east and south like Galicia and Bosnia, remained poor and agricultural. People in these less developed regions felt that the wealth of the empire was not being shared fairly. Young men from these areas often had to migrate to the big cities or even to America to find work. This economic inequality only deepened the sense of grievance among the different national groups, who felt they were being exploited by the ruling elites. The rise of neighboring nation-states also created problems. To the south, the newly independent Kingdom of Serbia became a beacon of hope for many Serbs and other South Slavs living inside the empire. Serbia promoted the idea of a unified South Slav state, or Yugoslavia, which was a direct challenge to Austro-Hungarian rule in the Balkans. Russia also positioned itself as the protector of all Slavic peoples, adding another layer of international pressure. The empire's leaders, especially in the military, saw Serbia as a major threat that needed to be dealt with, setting the stage for a future confrontation that would have devastating consequences. The event that triggered the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was an assassination. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting the city of Sarajevo in Bosnia. Bosnia was a province full of Serbs that had been annexed by the empire, a move that angered many. A young Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip shot and killed the Archduke and his wife Sophie. Princip was part of a group that wanted to free the South Slavs from Austro-Hungarian rule and unite them with Serbia. The assassination sent shockwaves across Europe and gave Austria-Hungary the excuse it had been looking for to crush Serbia. Austria-Hungary issued a harsh ultimatum to Serbia, a list of demands so severe that they were almost impossible to accept. When Serbia failed to meet all the demands, Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28, 1914. This single act triggered a chain reaction. Russia, seeing itself as Serbia's protector, began to mobilize its army. Germany, Austria-Hungary's powerful ally, then declared war on Russia. France and Britain were soon drawn into the conflict. What began as a regional dispute in the Balkans rapidly escalated into a full-blown European conflict, the First World War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had started a war it could not win. The war was a disaster for the empire. Its army was a patchwork of different nationalities, and many soldiers had little loyalty to the emperor. Czech, Polish, and South Slav soldiers were often unwilling to fight for a state that they felt oppressed them. Some entire units surrendered or defected to the other side. The war caused immense suffering at home, with severe food shortages, economic collapse, and massive loss of life. The fragile bonds that held the diverse empire together began to snap under the immense strain of 4 years of brutal, total war. The state was simply crumbling from within. By the autumn of 1918, the Austro-Hungarian military was on the verge of complete collapse. As defeat became certain, the different nationalities inside the empire declared their independence one by one. In October, Czechoslovakia and Hungary proclaimed their sovereignty. The South Slavs announced their intention to form a new state with Serbia. Poland was reborn as an independent nation. On November 11, 1918, Emperor Charles I, who had succeeded Franz Joseph, gave up his power, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire officially ceased to exist. The post-war peace treaties carved up its former territories, creating the new map of Central Europe that we recognize today, with countries like Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia rising from the ashes.